We're not really just talking about media, we're talking about something much deeper, because effectively we have a society without the capacity for a fair and even-handed conversation about anything worthwhile. A society which is in free fall, intellectually, psychologically, spiritually, morally, and to actually put yourself against the run of play is to announce yourself as a bad person. I noticed this first going back years ago when I was still a left-winger, or when I was still thought to be a left-winger. The nature of panel discussions on various programs. On one side, the side which was approved, the voices were invariably those of people who were regarded as good-thinking, right-thinking people. What they sought to put on the other side were people who were set up to lose the arguments by virtue of representing a view which could easily be disposed of on the basis of, for example, being Catholic. In the debate, there was to be a person always in each panel who you might say was manifestly wrong. And the idea was then that this person would become ritually defeated.
What would be so bad about it?
I'll tell you what would be so bad about it. Every amnesty is, by definition, is an abuse of Irish citizenry.
The majority of the tweets have been in reaction to her comments. A lot of people questioning why she's given a platform to speak on TV. Some people feeling that you didn't give her a hard enough time and that, you could have been a bit harder on her.
People actually think that for this to happen, that there needs to be a conspiracy, that there needs to be a room full of people deciding certain things. But there's a deep, deep culture at work here, which works off the idea that most of us like to be liked. We like to be approved of. And if you think of the dynamics of a newsroom, unless you're a very hard-nosed person, you cannot go in every day to meetings and take a particular line against everybody and have everybody excoriate you.
But the Polcars are very unhappy with that accusation, because they said, geez, we break our necks going down every day.
They don't break their necks, they're part of the narrative. They write the fairy tales for the people to consume.
So they would start at the first sentence and they would go and they would say, well, how do you know that, really? Who told you that? Are you sure about that? Have you evidence for that? Maybe there's a different way you could put that, just to protect yourself a little bit. And then we would move on to sentence 2 and so on and so forth. And this would go on, every sentence. It would take it 2 hours, 2.5 hours on the phone each time. And this went on for weeks and weeks, possibly months, until one day it stopped and it didn't happen then again. And I was thinking, wow, they just got off my case. Isn't that amazing? They've moved on to somebody else. But then a second thought occurred to me. I'm now doing to myself what they wanted to do to me. So you're told as an official, it is intimated to you that there's a particular correct way of looking at things. We don't have journalism. We don't have a media in any meaningful sense of the word. We have something else. We don't have a fourth estate. We have something else. We have something deeply corrupt at every level. We were trying to make reasonable arguments to do with the Constitution and so forth. Waste of time, complete folly. This was a debate which was engineered around the idea of emotions. Simplistic emotions, facile emotions, easily manipulated emotions. By making reasonable arguments, we were actually defeating our own arguments, because you seem to be coldly, dispassionately arguing about legalities, when what we were told was, well, love was the issue. You might expect from the way they dealt with the referendum that they had been campaigning for gay marriage for hundreds of years. No, maybe hundreds of days, but that's all. There is no record, there is no track record. The columnists who were excoriating their enemies on the basis of their bigotry had not written the articles that one would have inferred to exist. There's a word that's at the core of all this that we need to focus on, and that word is propaganda. Because I think we may have forgotten what propaganda really is. Propaganda isn't really just a kind of a relentless form of advertising. It's something much deeper. It goes to the very heart of how people think and what they think.
Ireland is nothing to be proud of. During Second World War, they didn't help the Jews to come to Ireland.
Only police protection stopped the mob from breaking into the house and saving his life. Whilst not a pogrom in the Russian sense, Craig's vituperative sermons terrified the Jewish community, most of whom knew from experience what they could lead to.
The victims of the Jews are mostly women of the house. She has to spare and stint in order to pay off the Jew without her husband knowing. Then follows misery, sorrow, and deceit.
Edward Bernays, who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, wrote in a book in 1928 called Propaganda. The most important thing about propaganda is that it be universal and continuous, hammering home the same message by diverse means again and again. The purpose is to regiment the mind of a society in the same way as an army drills its soldiers. Propaganda is most effective in the hands of what he called intelligent minorities. He didn't mean in that sense the kind of minorities we have now of victim groups. What he meant was intellectual elites seeking to guide society in particular directions. We are subjected, because in the mass media world we now live in, we think it's just background noise. You may hear an item, you may tune in. But all the time, this process is actually cleansing your mind of independent thought. This is the most important thing. Even when you're not listening, your mind is being purged of any thought of its own, making it ripe for the time when you do tune in to be told what to think, what position to take, what is the right position. I would say that this is something we should be teaching our children in schools, but of course that would be a ridiculous thing to say now, because they've already got to the schools. The schools are in the control of all of this thinking already. A Frenchman, Jacques Ellul, in 1965 wrote another book called Propagandas. And so Ellul said, once successfully propagandized, the individual ceases to be a passive recipient of the propaganda and becomes an evangelist. He takes vigorous stances, starts to oppose others. He asserts himself at the very moment that he denies his own self without realizing it.
He's trying to put blame on black or Muslim immigrants and stuff like that. It's hate speech.
He should be placed in like asylum or something.
His voting base that voted him, putting him in there, will continue his fascist, racist agenda.
To submit to propaganda, therefore, means to become alienated from oneself. Propaganda strips the individual, robs him of part of himself, and makes him live an alien and artificial life, to such an extent that he becomes another person and obeys impulses foreign to him. This is achieved by suffusing the individual in the emotions and responses of the herd, dissipating his individuality, freeing his ego of all confusions, unresolved contradictions and personal reservations. It pushes the individual into the mass until he disappears entirely.
I'm really fucking sorry that you had to face the shit that you did in this fucking country!
What we're dealing with here, it is actually the cutting edge of a wave of propaganda and ideology which has been cutting away at our societies, unbeknownst to us, for many decades. This goes back, just very briefly, there's a name for all this. It's called cultural Marxism. I don't necessarily agree with the term. I think it's too limited. It goes back to the Frankfurt School, which was a group which started in Frankfurt in the 1920s and then moved to New York. A group of very brilliant Jewish intellectuals. The problem is the way that a lot of their thinking has now been interpreted and applied culturally. And one of the ideas that this school was really big on was the idea that Marxism had failed in the Soviet Union for a simple reason that the proletariat had failed to step into its historically allocated role, because basically the proletariat wanted to just have bigger houses and more money and wasn't really interested in inheriting the earth. So they were stuck for a kind of a protagonist for the socialist revolution. And the task that the Frankfurt School, or one of the tasks the Frankfurt School set themselves, was to establish, identify and develop an alternative proletariat. And this they found in what we now can see recognisably as the victim classes and the victim ideologies that have sprung up around that, from feminism going on LGBT and so on. Trans is the latest one. And these are now being fed intravenously into our culture via the media in the most explicit and unashamed and unabashed way. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Crudely, what you can see is that in a sense every day we have this wash of nonsense which is sweeping through the minds of the population, cleansing them of any independent capacity for reflection. And then that is followed by a second wave which fills them with whatever the regime requires them to know.